Smoke and Mirrors, a psycho-spiritual journey through cannabis archetypes. This book is not a manual, nor is it a clinical guide. It is a mirror held up to the mind, the habits, the rituals, and the emotional landscapes we inhabit when we engage with cannabis. In many traditions, smoke symbolizes transformation. It blurs edges, softens the visible, and reveals the symbolic. Cannabis, too, holds this dual nature, part medicine, part mystery. It can heal or hide, awaken or sedate, depending on the hand and the heart of the user. Smoke and Mirrors is a psycho-spiritual journey through the patterns that emerge when we observe cannabis use through the lens of archetypes. These archetypes are not diagnoses, but stories, patterns of behavior, belief, and identity that reflect who we become when we use cannabis and why. Drawing on psychoanalysis, habit theory, neuroscience, and self-reflection, this book maps how childhood environments, emotional landscapes, and social conditioning influence the brain's reward system under the influence of THC. It offers not certainty, but a framework of exploration, a way to ask better questions about our relationship with the plant and ourselves. Every archetype in this book is someone's truth. Many are combinations, evolutions, or fleeting phases. What unites them all is the premise that cannabis doesn't define us, it reveals us. Let this be a guide, a challenge, and a companion, not to dictate how to use cannabis, but to understand how it uses us when we're not paying attention. Chapter 1. Foundations. Understanding the foundations of cannabis use. In this phase, we explore the underlying structures, biological, psychological, and environmental, that influence how individuals relate to cannabis. This phase lays the groundwork for everything else in the study, introducing the idea that cannabis use isn't random, but patterned, shaped by individual histories, brain processes, and emotional needs. We do this by creating archetypes, recurring character patterns that give us a language to interpret and organize diverse behaviors and motivations. These aren't rigid labels, but flexible interpretive tools, helping us humanize data and build bridges between emotion, cognition, and choice. Why use archetypes? Archetypes help us spot patterns in cannabis use over time, reflect on emotional motivations, escape, focus, or connection. It helps us examine childhood influences that shape coping behaviors and consider how neurobiology responds to cannabis. Think of them as behavioral lenses, like filters we use to make sense of how and why someone may use cannabis in a specific way. Biological foundations. Cannabis interacts with the endocannabinoid system, which helps regulate things like mood, memory, appetite, pain, and reward sensitivity. Different brains react differently to cannabis, and THC, the psychoactive compound, often interacts with parts of the brain like prefrontal cortex, PFC, involved in decision-making and abstract thinking. Amygdala processes fear and emotional memory. Hippocampus, memory and imagination. The basal ganglia, which influences motor control and habit loops. These effects vary depending on one's tolerance, mood, setting, and personal history. Psychoanalytic framing. From a psychoanalytic view, cannabis can serve symbolic roles. It may represent freedom, escape, or control. Act as a defense mechanism, numbing pain or resisting authority. Serve as a transitional object, something that bridges emotional gaps from childhood into adult life. Or be part of rituals that provide safety or stability, environmental influences. People's cannabis patterns are deeply shaped by their upbringing, culture, and social environments. We consider things like Was the person raised in a chaotic or structured home? Were emotions freely expressed or suppressed? Was cannabis introduced through family, friends, or rebellion? These elements inform not just how cannabis is used, but why it's used in that way. The 7 cannabis archetypes. These archetypes are flexible models, starting points for exploring deeper dynamics. Each archetype is defined by motivation, neurobiological tendencies, psychological function, environmental background, behavioral expression, cannabis experience, and potential risk patterns. 1. The dreamer. The dreamer uses cannabis to enhance imagination, escape into creativity, and explore inner worlds. Often highly introspective, but may struggle with grounding and follow-through. The escapee. The escapee uses cannabis to numb emotional pain or trauma and seeks sedation and emotional distance, often raised in unpredictable or neglectful environments. 3. The ritualist. The ritualist integrates cannabis into a daily structure or tradition and seeks control and comfort through repetition. Usage is habitual and often symbolic. The performer. The performer uses cannabis to enhance flow, focus, or performance, often in creative or high-pressure contexts, driven and expressive, but risks burnout or overdependence for productivity. 5. The rebel. The rebel sees cannabis as a form of protest or autonomy and often uses in defiance of norms, expressive, identity-driven, and emotionally charged. 6. The caretaker. The caretaker uses cannabis to self-soothe from emotional overload or empathy fatigue, highly attuned to others but vulnerable to emotional burnout and codependency. 7. The social chameleon. The social chameleon shifts cannabis style based on the group and is motivated by belonging and fluid identity, sensitive to social energy. These are not fixed categories. Many users will identify with multiple archetypes or move between them depending on mood, environment, or life phase. Application of Phase 1. Phase 1 helps us categorize individuals for deeper analysis in later phases by understanding the emotional logic of cannabis habits. By mapping patterns across people and time, we can prepare for intervention or support strategies matched to the archetype. Chapter 2, Archetypes in Depth. Psychoadaptive Mapping and Behavioral Analysis. In this chapter, we examine the core cannabis use archetypes introduced in Phase 1 through a deeper psychoadaptive lens. Each archetype is treated not as a static label, but as a fluid personality-environment cannabis interaction pattern that evolves over time. These models are not clinical diagnoses, but interpretive frameworks to help better understand user behavior, motivation, and potential adaptation pathways. The dreamer. Core drive, imagination, and visionary escape. Primary function of cannabis enhances abstract thinking, promotes flow, and generates creative ideation. Neurobiological pattern, increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, PFC, hippocampus, and default mode network, in DMN. Psychological mechanism. Cannabis provides a bridge between conscious and unconscious symbolism, blurs ego boundaries, allowing free association and narrative generation. Common environmental background. Emotionally permissive childhood or chaotic environments where fantasy provided safety. Behavioral themes. Creative bursts followed by burnout, highly verbal or expressive in altered states, or difficulty with routine or executive function. Therapeutic note. Dreamers benefit from anchoring practices, journaling, mindfulness, creative structure. Cannabis can be integrated with intentional flow sessions rather than spontaneous escapes. The escapee. Core drive, emotional silencing and/or trauma evasion. Primary function of cannabis: dampens reactivity, numbs intensity, and creates emotional silence. Neurobiological pattern: hyperactivation in the amygdala and limbic system with underactive PFC regulation. Psychological mechanism: cannabis disrupts negative feedback loops of trauma, recollection, or emotional flashbacks. Common environmental background: trauma, neglect, and/or emotional instability. Behavioral themes: behavior tendencies appear in a few ways. Ritualized smoking before bed or stressful tasks. Social withdrawal and avoidant tendencies. Preference for deep indicas or high CBD strains. Therapeutic note: cannabis may offer temporary relief but reinforces avoidance. Trauma-informed therapy, such as EMDR or somatic work, can complement cannabis use in structured settings. The ritualist: core drive, control, structure, and/or symbolic integration. Primary function of cannabis: grounding force, ritual for emotional or identity consistency. Neurobiological pattern: dopamine. Stability, strong basal ganglia habit loops. Psychological mechanism: cannabis is imbued with meaning, acts like a personal totem or grounding act. Common environmental background: rigid or highly structured family or cultural systems. Behavioral themes: ritualists show precise, repeated habits, same time, location, and strain. Experiencing anxiety when routine is disrupted and will have low reactivity to THC over time due to plateau effect. Therapeutic note: ritualists benefit from examining the symbolism of their habits. Cannabis journaling or ritual variation can increase awareness and emotional flexibility. The performer: core drive, enhancement, output, and/or aesthetic immersion. Primary function of cannabis: performance optimization, focus or flow amplifier. Neurobiological pattern: targeted activation in the prefrontal cortex, motor cortex, and occasionally reward centers. Psychological mechanism: cannabis externalizes inner clarity, acts as a performance stimulant in low to moderate doses. Common environmental background: high performance or high pressure upbringing, academic, artistic, or athletic expectations. Behavioral themes: the performer uses cannabis as a creative on-switch and high productivity, followed by sharp crashes, risking masking burnout or anxiety with stimulation. Therapeutic note: performers thrive when they cycle stimulation and recovery. Incorporating cannabis into performance must be paired with self-care boundaries and non-stimulant reflection time. The rebel: core drive, autonomy, opposition, identity freedom. Primary function of cannabis: symbol of personal freedom and cultural dissent. Neurobiological pattern: limbic reward sensitivity, dopamine reward linked to defiance. Psychological mechanism: cannabis becomes emotionally linked with resistance, self-determination, and authenticity. Common environmental background: authoritarian or highly moralistic upbringing. Systems of repression. Behavioral themes: the rebel often uses cannabis when integrating with music, protest, and/or art, and may challenge or reject treatment systems while often skeptical of institutions or standardized care. Therapeutic note: rebels benefit from reframing cannabis use through empowerment rather than opposition. Peer-led groups or narrative therapy may offer trust and resonance. The caretaker: core drive, emotional containment, boundary buffering. Primary function of cannabis: emotional dampening to prevent overwhelm. Neurobiological pattern: Cannabis modulates hyperactive amygdala, lowers cortisol. Psychological mechanism reduces empathic overload, helps maintain functioning in emotionally intense situations. Common environmental background: early caretaker roles, codependency, emotional inversion. Behavioral themes: the caretaker tends to smoke in solitude for resetting because they are prone to guilt or shame around self-care. They are often the caregivers in friend groups or families. Therapeutic note: cannabis is a support tool, not a solution. Caretakers benefit from space-making practices like creative solitude or personal boundaries. The social chameleon: core drive, belonging, mirroring, social fluency. Primary function of cannabis: social modulator, adapts experience to group energy. Neurobiological pattern: THC influences temporal lobe, medial PFC, and mirror neurons. Psychological mechanism: enhances attunement or group cohesion, reinforces context-based identity. Common environmental background: frequent code switching, performance identity, shifting social roles. Behavioral themes: the social chameleon cannabis experience varies widely based on company. They may lose self in social dynamics and are prone to identity fatigue or dependency on social cues. Therapeutic note: chameleons benefit from solitude sessions to explore personal reactions. Cannabis can serve as a mirror but must be paired with practices that affirm selfhood. Archetypal crossovers: while each archetype has a core pattern, users often exhibit blends. Dreamer escapees may use imagination to evade trauma. Caretaker ritualists may self-medicate due to compassion, fatigue within structured routines. Rebel performers might direct their defiance into high-profile creative careers. Mapping crossover profiles is key for nuanced support. Overlap does not dilute the archetype. It highlights complexity and growth potential. Clinical and self-directed applications: for researchers, fMRI imaging may show activation patterns consistent with archetypes, e.g., high PFC in dreamers. Archetypes can guide participant grouping, intervention strategies, and hypothesis formulation. For therapists, archetypes serve as diagnostic lenses, not fixed identities. They provide language for discussing cannabis use in depth and with nuance. Encourage clients to journal their archetype experiences across moods and settings. For users, archetypes offer self-reflective tools for conscious use. Cannabis use can become part of a personal growth journey rather than a passive behavior. Users may explore other archetypes as life changes, understanding that identity is fluid. Closing note for Chapter 2. These archetypes should not be used to label, restrict, or simplify. Instead, they are lenses, offering narrative, neurobiological, and therapeutic insight. Just as no two people respond identically to cannabis, no archetype exists in isolation. This phase is about understanding who is using, why they're using, and what patterns emerge in their inner world. Chapter 3: Archetype Evolution in Cannabis Over Time. Psychoadaptive drift, habitual fusion, and forecasting patterns. Cannabis use is not a fixed state behavior. It moves. It bends to mood, adapts to setting, and evolves as tolerance, memory, and emotional needs change over time. So do the archetypes introduced in earlier chapters. In this phase, we examine how individuals shift between archetypes, develop hybrid patterns, or experience regression into risk states. We'll explore how habitual use, emotional pressure, environmental change, and neurochemical adaptation all play a role in archetype evolution. This chapter introduces concepts like archetypal drift, psychoadaptive fusion, pattern forecasting, strain, influence on evolution and usage feedback loops. First, archetypal drift. Definition: a gradual transition from one dominant archetype to another, typically driven by emotional shifts, lifestyle changes, or neurochemical tolerance adaptation. Examples: a performer who burns out from overuse may drift into an escapee state. A dreamer seeking deeper meaning may evolve into a seeker-like fusion with the rebel or ritualist. Or a caretaker dealing with empathy fatigue who may shift toward ritualist stability for control. Drift is neither good nor bad, it's adaptive. It becomes risky when it goes unnoticed or is paired with unconscious use patterns. 2. Hybridization and psychoadaptive fusion. Definition: the coexistence of traits for multiple archetypes in a single user. This often occurs during identity shifts, personal development, or stress adaptation. Common blends. The dreamer rebel. An abstract visionary who uses cannabis as both tool and protest. The caretaker escapee. An emotionally overloaded person who uses cannabis for relief but risks emotional shutdown. The performer ritualist. A high achiever who relies on strict cannabis routines for functionality. These hybrid patterns are neither inherently unstable nor pathological. In fact, they often show increased archetype literacy, a user aware of how different cannabis motivations interplay. 3. Usage patterns that drive change. Factors accelerating archetypal evolution could be frequency and dose increase, often leads to tolerance, fatigue, or emotional detachment. Life events that cause grief, success, isolation, or trauma. Environment change such as moving, job shifts, new social circle, or strain change, switching from high THC to high CBD or vice versa. Cannabis may amplify or suppress certain emotional traits based on context. A rebel using CBD-dominant strains may become more introspective and less reactive, or a dreamer using high THC concentrates may drift into disorganized escapee patterns without structure. 4. Forecasting patterns. To predict how archetypes may evolve, we use a framework of mood tracking, usage frequency logs, setting context, reflective journaling, and strain and terpene profile analysis. Example of a forecast could be: if the user continues using high THC strains in social avoidance settings 4 times a week, likelihood of performer escapee drift increases within 6 weeks. Such forecasting can be modeled visually, covered in Chapter 4, and used for self-regulation, peer guidance, or therapeutic planning. 5th, feedback loop recognition. Cannabis behavior is cyclical. One of the most powerful self-awareness tools is the ability to recognize when feedback loops emerge, such as use for relief that develops into reinforcement and eventually dependency. Creativity rewarded by validation, which result in overuse and eventual detachment. Ritual, a factor of control creating habit and eventual identity fusion. Tracking these cycles helps users step outside them and adjust. 6. Evolutionary milestones. Archetypes can evolve toward either stabilization, greater self-awareness, intentional use, healthy rituals, or complication, rigid attachment, emotional suppression, and cognitive fatigue. Milestones of growth may include first tolerance, break with reflection, intentionally shifting strains based on goal, noticing drift and redirecting consciously, and/or using cannabis as part of a therapeutic goal, not a reaction. Closing note for Chapter 3. We are not defined by the way we use cannabis, but we can be shaped by it. Archetypes evolve because we evolve. When use becomes conscious, Archetype becomes not just a mirror, but a tool for transformation. In the next chapter, we'll explore how to track these shifts in real time, building forecasting tools, scoring systems, and interactive models that reflect user behavior over time. Chapter 4: Predictive Insights and Behavioral Reflection. Understanding how cannabis patterns shift over time. Cannabis use is dynamic. It reflects, adapts to, and sometimes amplifies our emotional and behavioral states. In earlier chapters, we explored the idea that cannabis archetypes are not fixed identities, but evolving expressions of motivation, emotional needs, and life context. In this chapter, we examine how cannabis use patterns may shift over time, how certain behaviors suggest movement between archetypes, and how reflection can support more conscious adaptation. While we mention possible scoring models and patterns, these are offered as interpretive frameworks, not prescriptions or diagnostic tools. Archetype fluidity and behavioral signals. As individuals grow, face stressors, or experiment with new environments and routines, their cannabis relationship often changes too. This can manifest as shifts in motivation, e.g., from curiosity to coping, changes in context, e.g., using more alone or more socially, mood correlations, e.g., cannabis feeling energizing one month, sedating the next, and/or strain reactivity, e.g., becoming more sensitive or detached based on dose or type. These changes don't necessarily indicate a problem, but they do represent opportunities for awareness. By paying attention to behavioral patterns over time, individuals may begin to notice rituals becoming rigid, possible shift toward ritualist, creative flow turning into withdrawal, dreamer drifting toward escapee, constant social mirroring, amplification of chameleon tendencies, increasing emotional detachment after use, emergence of escapee traits, and/or frequent use before tasked with pressure, performer archetype strengthening. These shifts don't happen overnight. They typically emerge as gradual adjustments in behavior, motivation, or emotional outcome. Recognizing these shifts can help individuals understand how their cannabis use is responding to life, not just acting on it. Mood, context, and intention as key indicators. 3 accessible entry points for reflection include: 1. Mood before and after use. Is cannabis softening an emotion, enhancing one, flattening it? 2. Context of use. Alone or social, ritual or impulsive, night versus morning? 3. Intentionality. Is there a conscious reason for use, or has it become automatic? Changes in any of these categories often parallel shifts in archetypal expression. For example, someone who began using cannabis to create art may later find themselves relying on it to reduce social anxiety, indicating a dreamer to chameleon drift. Reflective forecasting without metrics. Even without formal tracking, individuals can ask themselves, am I using cannabis the same way I was 3 months ago? What am I hoping to feel or not feel when I use? Is this pattern still supporting me emotionally, socially, and creatively? These questions aren't meant to induce guilt or judgment. They serve as invitations to observe cannabis use as a mirror, a reflection of deeper needs, fears, and transitions. Reframing drift as opportunity. Drifting between archetypes isn't inherently negative. It often signals that an individual's emotional or psychological landscape is shifting. With mindful observation, such transitions can be navigated with clarity. For instance, a performer noticing burnout may explore rest-oriented rituals instead of doubling down on output, or a caretaker recognizing emotional fatigue may reflect on how cannabis use can support rather than obscure self-care needs. Closing reflection of Chapter 4. In many ways, cannabis is a partner in process, a substance that doesn't just reflect who we are, but how we're changing. While it's possible to build systems to measure and track these shifts, this chapter emphasizes the value of simply noticing them. We are dynamic beings, and cannabis use evolves with us. Awareness is the most powerful tool available, especially when it's grounded in curiosity, not control. In Chapter 5, we'll turn to the idea of conscious use, how rituals, intention, and emotional alignment can deepen the relationship between cannabis, the self, and the space between. Chapter 5. Conscious Use and Ritual Design. Intentional Patterns, Emotional Readiness, and Reflective Integration. After exploring cannabis use through the lenses of identity, adaptation, and evolution, we now turn our attention to the idea of conscious consumption. In this context, conscious doesn't mean perfect, spiritual, or optimized. It simply means aware of one's motives, emotions, and outcomes. Cannabis is one of the few substances that interacts with intention in a highly noticeable way. The how, where, and why of use can dramatically shape the resulting experience. In this chapter, we explore how individuals might create intentional patterns around cannabis that foster grounding, creativity, healing, or personal growth. What is conscious use? Conscious use refers to cannabis consumption guided by self-awareness, intention, and contextual sensitivity. It recognizes that cannabis can either deepen connection or obscure emotion, depending on how it's used. Rather than categorizing use as good or bad, conscious use asks, what emotional state am I bringing into this session? What outcome am I hoping for? Or, how can I prepare the space internally and externally for that outcome? Ritual versus habit. Cannabis can be consumed as a ritual, symbolic, reflective, intentional, or a habit, automatic, repetitive, unexamined. The key difference lies in presence. Conscious rituals create space for awareness. Habits bypass it. Examples. For ritual, lighting a candle, playing ambient music, or journaling before use, and habitual use could be reaching for cannabis immediately after work without reflection. Shifting from habit to ritual doesn't require a complete lifestyle overhaul. Small, repeatable acts of intention make the difference. Personalizing use to emotional readiness. Different emotional states respond differently to cannabis. Some patterns to consider. Anxiety or overstimulation often benefits from calming environments, low stimulation strains, and breathwork before use. Sadness or grief may require extra reflection before consuming. Cannabis might soften or suppress the emotional process. Creative longing can be supported by rituals that open space such as journaling, painting, or walking with music. By tuning into emotional readiness, users may avoid numbing difficult feelings or amplifying ones they're not prepared to handle. The role of setting and environment. Cannabis, like dreams, is shaped by surroundings. Light, sound, smell, posture, and people all matter. A conscious user may ask, what kind of experience does this environment support? Am I alone or with someone I trust? Do I need stimulation or stillness? Simple shifts, adjusting lighting, clearing a space, Putting away distractions can help the cannabis experience support the desired outcome rather than drift toward detachment. Conscious use without perfection. Intentional use is not about getting it right. It's about noticing. When use becomes automatic, when emotion is being bypassed, or when rituals feel nourishing or numbing, there will always be sessions that feel clouded, accidental, or off. The point is not to avoid them, but to learn from them. The science behind conscious use. While ritual and intention may sound abstract, their effects are rooted in neuroscience and psychophysiology. Conscious cannabis use often results in noticeably different internal states because of the way attention, memory, and emotional regulation interact with THC and CBD. 1. Set and setting as neurocognitive modulators. The terms set, mindset, and setting, environment, originate from psychedelic research but are equally relevant to cannabis. These two factors influence how cannabis interacts with the default mode network, DMN, responsible for self-referential thought and mind-wandering. In dreamers and rebels, DMN activation under cannabis can lead to introspection or fantasy. In escapees, it may amplify rumination or detachment unless countered by setting. The amygdala, involved in fear and emotional processing. Conscious preparation can reduce anxiety-based overactivation. The prefrontal cortex, PFC, modulates planning and decision-making. Ritual and intention can enhance PFC engagement, improving clarity during cannabis use. Interpretive insight. Preparing a space before cannabis use isn't just aesthetic, it's neuroprotective. It influences what brain regions dominate the experience. Second, endocannabinoid tone and ritualized behavior. Regular cannabis use modifies endocannabinoid tone, the baseline functioning of the body's endocannabinoid system, ECS. This affects emotional regulation via anandamide modulation, dopamine sensitivity, reward anticipation and satisfaction, circadian rhythm and sleep cycles. Rituals can stabilize these shifts by offering predictable environmental cues that reduce stress reactivity and reinforce safe, structured neural pathways. Interpretive insight. Consistent rituals, like music, setting, dosage timing, can act as environmental scaffolding for an increasingly adaptable ECS, especially important for ritualists or caretakers prone to instability. Third, dose-dependent executive function outcomes. Cannabis has a biphasic dose-response curve, meaning small doses and high doses often produce opposite effects. Conscious use emphasizes titration, the act of finding an optimal dose, and reflection on post-use behavior. Low doses may improve verbal fluency, time sensitivity, and working memory, especially in performers and chameleons. High doses may suppress memory consolidation, induce dissociation, or impair self-monitoring, common in escapee states. Interpretive insight. Tracking post-use outcomes across doses allows users to understand their dose performance threshold. This supports long-term self-regulation, especially when paired with intention setting. Fourth, strain composition and cognitive outcome. Strain effects are determined by cannabinoid ratios, THC to CBD, and terpene profiles, e.g. limonene, myrcene, pinene. Different combinations shift cognitive emotional outcomes. High limonene plus THC, energetic, uplifted, may benefit performers or rebels. High myrcene plus CBD, sedative, emotionally grounding, ideal for caretakers, escapees. High pinene, memory retention, can counter THC-induced fog, beneficial for dreamers or ritualists. Interpretive insight. Choosing strains with intention, aligned with one's emotional state and archetypal goals, supports more predictable outcomes and reduces anxiety or burnout risk. 5. Neuroplasticity and behavioral conditioning. Cannabis modulates neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize pathways in response to experience. When paired with ritual or therapeutic reflection, cannabis use may reinforce positive emotional associations, reduce fear conditioning over time, deepen introspective or imaginative states, create anchor points for behavioral change. However, when unconscious or compulsive, it may also reinforce avoidance loops, compulsions, or maladaptive regulation strategies. Interpretive insight. Intentional use is not just philosophical, it may affect long-term neural wiring. Pairing cannabis with conscious emotional processing, journaling, or therapy may influence behavioral outcomes beyond the moment of use. Final reflections. Science meets subjectivity. Cannabis occupies a unique space. It is both biochemical and symbolic. While the science can guide us toward better outcomes, the subjective experience still matters. Conscious use acknowledges that brain chemistry matters, but so does story. Setting affects neurocognition, but also soul. Dosage affects memory, but also metaphor. When ritual, science, and self-awareness converge, cannabis use becomes less about control and more about alignment. Closing note for Chapter 5. Cannabis offers more than effect. It offers a mirror. When we engage it with even small moments of presence, we begin to align use with growth. Conscious use is a practice, not a prescription. It unfolds as we observe our motivations, set rituals that reflect our needs, and allow each session to teach us something about the plant and about ourselves. Chapter 6. Social Patterns and Cultural Mirrors. Cannabis use in group dynamics, identity play, and social influence. Up to this point, we've focused largely on cannabis use as an internal and individual process, how it affects emotion, identity, ritual, and motivation. But cannabis use doesn't happen in a vacuum. It often occurs with others, around others, or in relation to how others see us. In this chapter, we shift our lens outward, toward the social field of cannabis use. This includes everything from peer influence to cultural symbolism, group rituals, and the fluid roles we play when consuming in company. 1. Cannabis use as a social mirror. Cannabis doesn't just alter how we feel. It can alter how we behave socially. In group settings, it may loosen inhibitions, heighten sensitivity to others' moods, encourage bonding through shared rituals, and amplify social anxiety or performance pressure. In certain archetypes like the social chameleon or rebel, these shifts can be especially pronounced. Some individuals adapt their persona with ease, while others feel exposed or destabilized. Interpretive insight. Cannabis used in social settings can serve as a mirror, reflecting back how we want to be perceived or how sensitive we are to social energy. 2. Group dynamics and archetype expression. Each archetype responds differently in group settings. Here's a broad interpretive guide. Archetype social pattern. Possible social risk. The dreamer becomes imaginative, abstract, playful, may disengage or feel misunderstood. The escapee withdraws and blends into the background and may dissociate in social overwhelm. The ritualist anchors with routine and may become rigid or resistant to new dynamics. The performer takes lead, energizes the group, and may overextend or mask inner anxiety. The rebel challenges norms, uses cannabis as a symbol, and may dominate or provoke without reflection. The caretaker manages mood of group while staying attuned, prone to emotional exhaustion or overgiving. The chameleon adapts completely to group vibe and may lose personal identity or overindulge. Reflection point. Ask yourself, who do I become in the room when cannabis is involved? Is that role nourishing, performative, or both? 3. Peer influence and identity drift. Social cannabis use often introduces peer mirroring behaviors, matching dose, strain, or ritual without personal alignment, adopting speech or energy patterns for acceptance, or using cannabis as a social ticket or signal of belonging. This can be empowering shared language, ritual, trust, but also risky, especially for individuals prone to masking or code switching in non-cannabis settings. Key insight: repeated group experiences can condition an identity that only feels real or safe when cannabis is present. Fourth, cultural framing of cannabis use. Cannabis use is not interpreted the same way across cultures, communities, or social classes. These differences shape how users internalize their behavior. Examples: in some communities, cannabis is linked to spirituality or ancestral healing. In others, it may symbolize rebellion, survival, or resistance. In some social classes, it is associated with leisure and mindfulness. In others, it may carry criminality, stigma, or moral judgment. Interpretive insight: cannabis use may hold multiple meanings at once: identity, resistance, refuge, expression, depending on how and where it's being used. Fifth, group rituals and collective conditioning. Many users first encounter cannabis through group rituals: a shared circle, a ceremonial blunt, a friend's couch. These rituals shape early impressions and may create a template for future use, encode social roles, e.g., the roller, the vibe checker, the lightweight, the veteran, and embed use within emotional memories of bonding or belonging. These early group dynamics can be affirming or conditioning, and many individuals replay them unconsciously for years. Reflection. Prompt: what early social cannabis rituals shaped how you engage with the plant today? Sixth, social recovery and solitary reclamation. Many users find that after extended social use, they need periods of solitude to reconnect with personal motives, redefine cannabis outside peer roles, and reflect without external influence. This solitary use is not antisocial. It can be restorative, especially for chameleons or caretakers who over-adapt in groups. Creating solo rituals can help recover personal meaning, reestablish boundaries, and shift use from reactive to reflective. Closing note for Chapter 6. Cannabis is a relational substance. It connects, reflects, and amplifies. By examining how it shapes our roles in groups and how groups shape our experience, we gain a deeper understanding of cannabis not only as a plant, but as a cultural mirror. Chapter 7. Long-term patterns and evolving identity. Navigating change, tolerance, and archetype maturation over time. Cannabis use, like identity, is not static. Over months and years, it adapts, reorients, and reflects the evolving psychological, emotional, and physiological terrain of the user. Some individuals become more intentional and integrated in their use, while others develop reinforcing loops of avoidance or dependency. Most navigate both at different points in time. This chapter explores what long-term use reveals, not just about cannabis, but about the self. We look at how cannabis interacts with neural adaptation, tolerance, emotional regulation, and behavioral identity, leading to either archetypal expansion or stagnation. Time as a revealer of pattern. Short-term use tends to highlight preference, strain type, context, routine. Long-term use reveals tendency, emotional themes, coping styles, and behavioral reinforcement. Over time, patterns emerge in emotional regulation, reliance on cannabis to decompress or escape, cognitive processing, mental clarity versus fog across doses, social role, always being the group guide, roller, or initiator, and ritual evolution, shifting from spontaneous to structured use. Neuroscience insight. Chronic cannabis use can lead to functional neuroadaptation, where the brain adjusts receptor density, especially CB1 receptors, and regional activation. Over time, this rewires emotional, cognitive, and motivational responses to both cannabis and everyday experiences. Tolerance, adaptation, and neurochemical saturation. One of the most defining features of long-term cannabis use is the buildup of tolerance. This occurs when the endocannabinoid system downregulates CB1 receptor availability. THC becomes less subjectively potent, and higher doses are needed to achieve the same effect. Tolerance often forces reflection. Is my dose increasing while my satisfaction plateaus? Am I using for the same reasons as I did a year ago? Is the ritual becoming mechanical rather than meaningful? Interpretive. Note, this is not inherently problematic. It's simply a signal, an inflection point where users can choose to pause, shift, or reaffirm their use with new awareness. Archetype maturation and cognitive flexibility. As people mature emotionally and cognitively, so can their archetype expression. What begins as a reactive or compensatory pattern, e.g., the escapee, may, with reflection and behavioral shifts, transform into a more adaptive or hybrid archetype. Examples of an archetypal maturation. A performer who once relied on cannabis for output learns to use it as a support for post-task restoration. A ritualist who once clung rigidly to routine introduces flexible, mood-based adjustments. And a rebel evolves from reactionary behavior into aligned activism, using cannabis as part of a cultural expression rather than opposition neurocognitive framing. This process of transformation likely involves increased executive function, PFC activity, and interoceptive awareness, both of which can be supported by reflective practices like journaling therapy and mindfulness. Life stages and usage evolution. Cannabis use often shifts in relation to age, responsibility, and life roles. During adolescence, early adulthood, identity exploration, novelty seeking, and peer modeling are prioritized. Adulthood, jonkers midlife, coping, regulation, performance enhancement, and introspection. In later life, pain relief, spiritual reflection, and routine stabilization. Each phase carries risks and opportunities. Young rebels may not develop coping tools outside cannabis. Midlife ritualists may over-identify with cannabis as emotional regulation. Or elder caretakers may turn to cannabis for comfort without addressing deeper needs. Developmental psychology insight. As the prefrontal cortex matures, typically by age 25, individuals gain greater capacity for metacognition, thinking about their own thinking. This makes archetype reflection and ritual adjustment more available in later stages of use. Signs of archetypal stagnation. Without periodic reflection, long-term cannabis use may become psychologically inflexible, a kind of identity drift without conscious direction. Signs of stagnation may include using cannabis to feel normal rather than intentional, rituals becoming obligatory, not meaningful, resistance to breaks or dosage changes, feeling emotionally flat or creatively stalled after use, and/or dismissing feedback about usage impact on relationships or mood. Neural parallel. This stagnation may correlate with decreased dopaminergic sensitivity, leading to reduced reward from both cannabis and non-cannabis sources. Users may find joy or engagement harder to access over time without change in use patterns. Integration and symbolic meaning. For many long-term users, cannabis evolves into a symbol, a lens through which deeper processes are understood. It becomes not just a substance, but a story, a mirror of emotional cycles, a companion through grief or trauma, a key to creative ritual or spiritual grounding, or a reminder of a former self, or a portal to one still forming integration, is when cannabis use reflects not just coping, but meaning making. It may accompany therapy, art, journaling, somatic work, or ceremonial use, but always grounded in awareness of its evolving role. Closing reflection. Time is the ultimate clarifier. As cannabis use stretches across years, its effects move beyond the moment and into the realm of who we become. With each phase of life, each archetypal shift, and each moment of reflection, users are offered the same question in different forms. Is this still serving who I am becoming? When that question is asked consistently, cannabis stops being a crutch or a script and becomes a conscious part of personal evolution. In the next chapter, we close the journey by summarizing the insights gathered across all phases and offering a glossary of key concepts for continued reflection. Chapter 8. Closing reflections, integration, interpretation, and the ongoing journey. Throughout this book, we've explored cannabis not as a fixed habit, diagnosis, or cultural monolith, but as a living relationship between a person, a plant, and the psychological and social environments they inhabit. We introduced 7 archetypes, not as boxes to fit into, but as mirrors for introspection. We examined how the brain responds to cannabis over time, how motivation evolves, and how use patterns shift under pressure, trauma, routine, or growth. We trace cannabis from solitary reflection to group dynamics and into long-term identity development. Each phase of this framework invites the same message. Cannabis doesn't define you, but how you use it might reveal something about you. This is not a guidebook for right or wrong use. It is a collection of patterns, reflections, and models, offered so that individuals can meet their own experience with more awareness, curiosity, and compassion. Continued exploration. This work is not complete, it's a living inquiry. As the legal, cultural, and therapeutic landscapes around cannabis continue to evolve, so too will the tools for understanding it. Archetypes may shift, cultural roles may reframe, neurobiological models will deepen, but the core remains. Cannabis use is complex, not simple. Patterns are fluid, not fixed. Consciousness, ritual, and self-reflection matter. Whether you are a long-time user, a curious newcomer, a clinician, or simply an observer, this book hopes to serve as a companion in reflection, not a set of instructions. Thank you. This work is offered not as doctrine, but as dialogue. May it open space for deeper understanding of your relationship with cannabis, and perhaps more importantly, with yourself.